Shanghai, the most cosmopolitan city in China, is home to American companies, businesses, and even universities. How they're doing amidst the rising tension between the world's two largest economies. Can the U.S. decouple from its biggest economic partner? And how is public opinion shaping the views of Americans and Chinese hold of each other? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Lin Songtian, President of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, Kenneth Jarrett, Senior Advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, and Chen Dongxiao, President of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. And today we have a special edition of Dialogue, and we are now in the city of Shanghai. And today's topic is China-U.S. relations. Because the context is, of course, there are a lot of talks about the U.S. and China is in a phase of tension strategically. But I know that President Lin has been traveling to several places in Shanghai. This is a contact point between Chinese and Americans in many different ways. So according to your understanding, where are we in terms of China-U.S. relations?
Now you go to the media or to watch TV, including the internet. The relationship between China get very, very high the tension and a lot of company news. But I think that is not the whole picture of these relations. So this is why I came here, try to look for the right answer to two simple but very important questions. One is, where do the China-American relations come from? Second, whether or not China-American relations serve the fundamental interests of our two countries. President Nixon told Chairman Mao Zedong, there are no reasons for us to be enemies.
It is very interesting to notice that you said there is no reasons for China and America to become enemies. But has that strategic reading changed because of the changing geopolitical, geoeconomic situation, Kenneth?
Statement that there's no reason to be enemies.
But there are lots of signals pointing that way.
Well, it's a question of nomenclature, right? Because you can be competitors, you can even be adversaries. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an enemy. At the moment, even if we recall President Nixon's visit to China and what motivated him to come here and why China was interested in reaching some kind of understanding with the United States, and compare that to today, we are facing a new direction for U.S.-China relations. Again, it doesn't mean that the two countries are fated to become enemies, but in terms of, if you look at the scale of cooperation and competition, even since the famous Nixon visit, U.S.-China relations have been at different points along that scale. And now it's definitely moving more in the direction of competition. And you could say that the two governments should be able to manage a competitive relationship, but if it's too adversarial, that's not actually constructive or healthy for either government. So the challenge, I would say, for both governments now is to reach some kind of accommodation.
Yeah, as you said, probably it's more of a government's strategic thinking about where the relationship is. Because I've been visiting some American businesses, it seems they are in no rush to stop their business. They want to expand their businesses in Shanghai.
Right, so if you look at so for many years I ran the American Chamber of Commerce here in Shanghai. The commitment of American business to this market remains very strong. So whether you ask companies about shifting investment thinking, or actually shifting of production, or their long-term prognosis for this market. And all those areas, the overwhelming majority of companies will say that they feel that China is an attractive market and that they're here for this market. So they're not intending to leave.
Then, Mr. Chen, where do you think the tension come from?
Politically speaking, I think that the U.S. government, I mean the sitting government, as well as quite a number of Congress people in the United States, they are quite doubtful or even challenge the presumption which have supported the U.S.-China cooperation-focused relationship for so many years, is whether the rise of China itself is fundamentally in the interest of the United States. They increasingly tend to see the U.S.-China relationship from a zero sum. The rise of China not necessarily means a plus for the United States, number one. Secondly, I think that in the past 4 decades, opening up the reform, with the comprehensive power of China's on the rise, as well as the competitiveness of China as a whole, catching up, even among many American entrepreneurs, companies around the world. They feel the pressure. They feel the pressure of competitiveness from China. And they are not so happy, quote unquote, about the environment in which they think that they are unfairly treated in competing with China, particularly in Chinese market. That's their perception.
The problem is their perception fair? The American Chamber of Commerce reported in Shanghai, they said that 70% do not plan to move their production out of China. 80% companies are making profits in China. If that's the majority, why they should be complaining about running their business?
We're talking about different things. So if we're talking about the experience of U.S. companies here, the fact that the majority are committed to the market and that the majority are profitable doesn't mean there aren't features of the market here that are challenges for them and that make them frustrated. Because you could argue...
But are those features the big picture right now? We're talking about American businesses' exposure to Chinese market.
So if we're talking about U.S.-China relations big picture, I would say that the commercial part is just one small piece of it. Now the reason, perhaps because you're here in Shanghai and this is a big commercial center, you might be focused particularly on that dimension. Or the fact that so U.S.-China trade frictions, as is what kind of unleashed the current sort of stress between the two governments of the two countries. But that's actually just a small piece of what's going on. It's more of what Professor Chen just mentioned in terms of the shifting power relationship between the two countries.
And what kind of dimensions are the American businesses who harbor those complaints are looking at? And what kind of a change they're expecting?
Look into detail in terms of the AmCham survey. There's a list of operational challenges that companies face as well as regulatory issues. So intellectual property rights, or the ease of getting licenses, or a sense that local companies are still perhaps treated differently in terms of government procurement. So there are areas. These are areas that have been improving over the years, but these are still lingering issues. And for most companies, I would say that the biggest issue for them would be market access. Now, over the years, China has taken many steps in that area, but in terms of the market, there's still parts of the market that are closed off to foreign investors. So this has nothing to do with the United States.
Okay. Mr. And I want to respond to what Kenneth said.
We have to recognize there's real differences of different level of the market access between Chinese market and U.S. market. This is the reality. And partially, I think, they're related to the different level of development itself. And of course, China is catching up very quickly. And I think for American companies, including, I think, the sitting government itself, they think that China should do more to open its market.
They complain about the pace, not the direction.
Yes, I think so. So they are much more impatient. But those kind of impatience has been hijacked or have been politicized by some politicians in the United States who believe, as I said, that those people think the rise of China, economic, whether it's a soft power, hard power, is not in the interest of the United States.
So
those people
this is a good point. Do you think that American politicians and businesses are on the same page about what they worry about China's terms?
So American politicians, they will not have as complete an understanding of
the business
situation here in China as American companies. I mean, that's to be expected because companies are living...
But they've been played up that narrative so that it will work for them.
Well, in terms of, even for the Trump administration, they're trying to improve things for U.S. companies. They are, and they feel that, so their preferred approach was tariffs, and they felt that this gave them fresh leverage and would put pressure on the Chinese government. Now, the fact is most U.S. companies, so they welcome greater pressure on the Chinese government. They didn't necessarily welcome the use of tariffs because that sort of complicates life for even for U.S. companies because they get caught up in this as well. But the question of, I guess, what points of leverage you have is something that, particularly with the Trump administration, they felt that when they came into office, that previous administrations had used existing dialogues and had spent many years talking with China, and there was incremental progress, but this progress wasn't sufficient. And it kind of reached a bit of a boiling point, where then the Trump administration felt that the approach of the past wasn't working, we had to try something new.
My understanding is completely different. We are very new to understand how about the international rule, how to learn from the world, how to improve ourselves, how to open our market, everything to the world. But open to Tesla, the strongest, the leading company in the world. We let them have 100% all by themselves and operate it in an American way.
The China message is very loud and clear. We welcome American businesses, but it seems the Chinese always believe in incrementalism, gradualism. We don't want to be rushed into doing things that we don't want to do. So don't Americans buy that message?
But I think this is a source perhaps of a different perception. So to stick with the Tesla example, so yes, it's true, when Tesla came here, they did insist on coming as a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, because at that point in time, China still had the rule for new energy vehicles that had to be a joint venture, but they had already announced that in 2022 they were going to drop the requirement for joint ventures. So in the case of Tesla, this was a good example.
It's a big challenge to China.
It's a good example of the economics and politics came together, and Tesla got a very good arrangement, because Tesla insisted they would only come as a wholly owned enterprise, and then China accelerated their regulatory change to allow that. But I guess the point I'd like to respond to is, because I do get the feeling that China feels that if they invite Tesla to come and open a facility here, this is something generous or a gift that they give to Tesla. If a Chinese company wants to...
They believe it is only a gesture, is not a strategy.
But previously China had many restrictions, and even if you look at the big automakers now, they're still locked into joint venture agreements.
As before. But that is changing too.
That is changing, but that's only changing now. And then the question is 20 years a reasonable period of time?
So basically you're arguing that China is no longer a developing nation. They should not protect the many industries that they used to protect.
Well, what I'm saying is that people try, here the key is one has to have a certain empathy. So for me as an American living in China, I do try to see the situation here from the perspective of the Chinese government, as I try to understand.
But perhaps we need to recognize the progress we have made. Step by step,
because we need to understand how foreign companies and foreign governments react to things here, because if you feel that 20 years is a very fast pace of opening up, most Americans would not agree with that.
Okay, Mr. Chen, I want you to respond to that. How faster should China open up, and in what ways, what areas that can satisfy both Americans and other countries' needs and Chinese own needs?
Chinese opening up the reform. The main mission, purpose, is to realize the strategic goal of China per se, rather than try to please some other countries, number one. And in terms of to realize the so-called strategic goal, we have several the goal targets in the next 30 years, 50 years ahead of us. I think that fundamental objective is whether that those average people in China, their living standard could be upgraded. And that's, I think, is also the objective of the government. But in order to implement such kind of objective, opening up is the prerequisite condition for that. And I think that...
But Candace said you haven't opened up enough.
Yes, this is I think, always a half empty, half full phenomenon. And I also recognize that sometimes even those people in China, Chinese people themselves, have underestimated how quickly we have already developed in the past decades. And we somewhat underestimated the spillover or kind of image that we have produced, perceived by outside world. And sometimes even think that that is a very good, willing feeling by many Chinese people to try to showcase that we have made a good progress in the past 4 decades, and we always bring them to Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, all those coastline areas. But we forget that those areas still less developed areas. So I think that the American people, even if they understand to some extent the difference in China, but they are not fully appreciative of the diversity of China per se. And they even could not recognize that even today, there are still hundreds of millions of those people living under the poverty line, and the government is still trying to work on that as our first task force.
So, message is you cannot treat China as a developed country as you would treat other partners in Europe. There are a lot of talks about decoupling China and the United States, mostly from the U.S. side. Do you think that really can happen, decouple the two largest economies in the world?
So decoupling is, I would say, I would understand it as a politically driven effort to separate parts of the economy. So it's separate from supply chain decisions that are driven simply by business or economic considerations, because you could have a particular facility that's here in Shanghai, and then because of the cost of manufacturing or labor, if somebody concludes that it doesn't make financial sense to be here, and they go to Vietnam, or they go to Cambodia. So even if you look at China's economic structure, a lot of apparel making or toys, the low-end manufacturing, this has been leaving China anyway. Now, this is not what we mean by decoupling.
But all those political decisions will probably serve as not only a message, but incentives for businesses to consider their future.
So political pressure this is most apparent in the IT area, and there's a certain amount in pharmaceutical that is different, because pharmaceutical is driven more by national security considerations, where governments feel that they want to have a domestic capability to produce PPE or pharmaceutical products, that they don't want to rely on the supply chain if that supply chain breaks down, as we've seen in the COVID-19 case. But to take IT, so then you have government directives that create barriers either through export controls or designations of companies that prevent U.S. companies from doing business with certain Chinese companies.
But do you think it's possible? My belief is, I think it's very difficult, because why? Politician is free to talk, but business is business.
No, so
the business is look at for where's my profit. The profit is the stability is very important. The social country stability is the key. First, you have to, efficiency is very important to make a profit. Efficiency means that the infrastructure must go fast, right? China, the interaction of the connectivity of the infrastructure, I think you understand here, and also whatever you have, Americans have the finance strengths, high technology strengths, talent strengths, but all these strengths you need market. No market, no strength at all, because the market is here. We have 1.4 billion population with more than 400 million mid-income population, means the market is here. So the high technology means the market are huge in China, and this is American strength. So how can you isolate yourself from this huge market?
No, but you're leaping, so I didn't have a chance to finish. You're leaping to a certain definition of decoupling before I explain what I mean by decoupling. So you're defining decoupling as the two economies having a
totally
complete divorce.
goodbye.
So that's not possible.
That's not possible.
Because the two economies
only in
are still
several
integrated.
sectors and several
And even in those sectors, so you can take healthcare, for example. So even if the U.S. government says that domestically in the United States, we want to make sure we can produce a certain amount of ventilators or masks. So I suspect that this is likely to happen, but it doesn't mean that the big pharma companies are going to leave the China market. So that will continue. So decoupling as a political objective defined as, let's say, very hawkish elements, which is complete separation of the two economies, this is not going to happen because globalization is too far along and it can't go back.
What the sectors will be impacted the most?
When we talk about the so-called decoupling, there's a economic logic, there's a political logic, and there's also a security logic, shared both by those entrepreneurs or the U.S. government. We should not overestimate those diversified strategy of entrepreneurs based upon their economic logic, because given such a turbulent, relatively unforeseen period of time, it's quite natural for any business people to try to diversify, to reduce to, as we Chinese saying, put the eggs in all basket. And we should not overstress or exaggerate the so-called, this is a kind of a decoupling, because those kind of so-called decoupling will be there for a long period of time.
But I want to focus on one sector in particular, that's tech, because many people say tech supremacy will be the biggest battle for China and the U.S. Who will design the first artificial intelligence system, the high-speed communication system, and the best robotics in the world? That's why the U.S. and China at each other's throats at the moment. Yes. Do you think we really have to go to war, confrontation over this?
This is quite uncertain prospect ahead of us. Obviously, I think there's a consensus in Washington, whether it is White House or Congress, believe that China is catching up in a very quick way. And the United States, in order to maintain its so-called monopoly,
or supremacy,
they need to keep distance far away. And therefore, they need to use different ways, whether you put Chinese company into the so-called entity list, or with a different, a long arms jurisdiction, or whatever ways, to try to, slow down the catching up speed with many of those politicized excuse.
So
this is a really concern. But for those scientists, for those silicon company
engineers entrepreneurs,
themselves, they believe in the long term it will be lose-lose. It will be.
That's why the disconnect happens. For entrepreneurs and engineers and scientists, it's better to work in concert around the world. But for politicians' point of view, they want to sever the ties. But which one will serve the longer interest for both peoples and countries? Kenneth?
They're different interests. So it's not
tech.
Right. So I'm not talking about technology. The reason I'm saying that people are focused on different dimensions. If you are an AI engineer, whether it's here or in Silicon Valley, what you want is the ability to move freely back and forth and collaborate with whoever you wish to collaborate with, because you're not necessarily focused on national security issues. But a government has to be mindful of national security considerations. Now, you can argue that perhaps
whether there is hysteria, overreaction,
so it's a question of,
out of the concern of national security.
So China would argue that the U.S. is overreacting. Yeah. The U.S. would probably say, so I'm not a government official, but if you had somebody from the Trump administration, I suspect that they would say, well, for many years we were not paying attention, and that in fact we were helping to facilitate China's technological development, and we feel now that this is a risk to the United States, and they're trying to correct for that, which is why you're seeing many new policies, and this comes as a bit of a shock to people in China because it is a very different approach. So again, the challenge, for us is to try to, I guess, understand why each side is doing what they're doing, and then see what can be done, perhaps to soften, the hard edges of some of this.
And interestingly, understanding each other is becoming more and more difficult because of the current climate. For example, the Pew Research recently pointed out more than 70% of Americans have a negative view of the Chinese and the China. Probably even higher number here in China towards the Americans. So public opinions do shape narratives and outlook for both countries. What are you going to do?
Misunderstanding is now is some problem because when the public opinion in America is negative, but when I tour around in Shanghai, I met so many American friends here. I think the response to me is very positive. Very positive. So this is whether or not this relation serve the fundamental interests of the two nations and serve the people, we have to come down to the people, not only some people in the media or something like that. We have to come down to ask the business people or the American people here. So for me, as a Chinese People's Association, to people, for friendship with foreign country, I like to open more door, build more platform for the two people and all the people from the world to come to China to have a look. See is believing. I got three messages for the bilateral relation between China and America. First, the general direction for the win-win cooperation for common development will not change. The second is both the Chinese people and American share the common aspiration for a better life or a better world. The third is, I think, is we can work together to make that a common dream become true. So if we see each other as an enemy, we can fight every day, and we can destroy each other, destroy the world. But if we can change the perception, we could be friends.
Is it also the mainstream view of the American politicians? That's a big question.
Well, President Lin was talking about his interaction with American people here. You're asking about American politicians, so this is a different slice of the population. I guess, I mean, my first reaction would be, so I don't know if we want to frame the question as either friends or enemies. I mean, it's because right then you're setting up a kind of dichotomy which is harmful, because you're saying, so if you can't be a friend, you're an enemy. It's not necessarily one or the other. So I mean, we should ask ourselves,
we say confrontational or cooperational?
No, or maybe we should just say
competitive partners.
How can we work together? Where can we work together? You know, for us, Americans to understand China and China to understand the United States, we don't have to put it in the context of you're a friend or an enemy, because I think that's too absolute, and it's going to be somewhere in between.
And there is another worrying sign that is happening in the academia and educational field. There seems to be a worrying sign that restrictions will be put on that, especially from the U.S.
For the current administration, Trump administration, the message is quite clear. They don't welcome the Chinese students. We have already seen quite a strong resistance from some universities. Harvard, Yale, and those chancellors, presidents, they all say that it's a self-defeating policy, and it will be for a long period of time, a big loss for American academic development themselves. I fully agree with that. But we have to recognize that nowadays, as we talk about the economic decoupling a couple of minutes ago, I think that there's also a trend, at least in a sitting government of U.S. nowadays. They try to, pursue some policy of a academic or cultural decoupling.
Yeah.
Because they think that with a different, very groundless, and also I think that very absurd accusation that those students in U.S. do something as a kind of espionage or a challenge in national security interests of the United States. So I think that it's kind of an overstatement, exaggeration, and very much politicized. So I'm quite worried about that.
Strategically insecure, is that the American psyche now?
I think the American psyche has suffered a number of blows in recent years, from the financial crisis to Iraq, Afghanistan, and just a sense of the country's direction. If I were a psychiatrist and America were my patient and China's my patient and I'm talking to them, I would find that the psychological state is very different of the two patients. And unfortunately, this is leading to tensions between the two. So that's much of what we're coping with.
Okay, we are running way out of time. Thank you very much for your analysis and insights, Kenneth, Mr. Lin, and Mr. Ted. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.